The wind came down off the mountains like a living thing that night, clawing at the shutters of Mercy Creek with a hunger that made the old miners pull their coats tighter and mutter prayers they had not said since childhood. Inside the Silver Lantern Saloon, the fire popped and hissed against logs, slick with melting snow, and Sarah Whitaker moved between the tables with a tray balanced on one hip, smiling at men who had nothing left in their pockets but dust and debt, because somewhere far away, a boy named Tommy was counting the days until his sister kept her promise. She did not know that before the night was through, that promise would nearly cost her everything, and that a stranger sitting alone near the fire, a man who had not spoken more than a dozen words since he arrived in town 2 days before, was about to remember why he had once been a man other men feared to cross. Caleb Boone had chosen the corner table because it let him watch the door without being watched himself, a habit forged in places far harder than this frozen mining town. And though the miners around him laughed and argued over cards, his eyes carried a stillness that did not belong to the room, the stillness of a man who has already lost everything he loved and has nothing left for the world to take. He had buried his wife and his daughter 20 years before, when a mining company in another territory let a fire tear through the shanties where the workers' family slept, too cheap to build proper walls, too greedy to care. And Caleb had been 3 miles away breaking horses for a rancher's wage when the smoke rose black against the morning sky. He had run the whole distance and arrived in time only to hold what remained. And in the 2 decades since, he had drifted from town to town, never staying long enough for anyone to ask his name twice. Because a man who carries that kind of fire in his chest learnt quickly that closeness only multiplies the things that can be torn from him. Mercy Creek was supposed to be one more stop on a road that led nowhere in particular. But the saloon door swung open at 9 o'clock sharp and brought with it a different kind of cold. Daniel Blackwood walked in like he owned the floorboards beneath his boots, because in every way that mattered to the law in that county, he did, his father having bought the sheriff's loyalty along with half the claims in the valley. And the moment he crossed the threshold, the laughter in the room thinned to silence, the way a candle thins when a door opens somewhere in the house. He was young, not yet 30, with the soft hands of a man who had never swung a pickaxe in his life, and the swagger of one who believed that fact made him better than the men who had. Whiskey had already loosened his tongue and his temper, and his eyes found Sarah across the room the way a hawk finds a rabbit in an open field. He crossed to her in 4 long strides and seized her wrist before she could step away, his grip hard enough to whiten her knuckles, and he pulled her close enough that she could smell the liquor on his breath. "There's my favorite girl," he said, and the words came out thick and pleased with themselves. Sarah kept her voice steady, the way she had learned over 3 long winters in that saloon, and told him she was tired tonight, that she meant no offense, that perhaps another evening would suit better. But Daniel Blackwood was not a man accustomed to hearing the word no spoken to his face, and when she finally said it plainly, when she looked him dead in the eye and told him no, the whole room seemed to draw one collective breath and hold it. For 3 full seconds, nothing moved. Then his face went the color of a bruise, humiliation curdling fast into rage, because every miner in that saloon had just watched the richest man's son be refused by a saloon girl, and a man like Daniel Blackwood could survive almost anything except being made small in front of witnesses. His hand found the revolver at his hip before his mind had finished deciding to draw it, and the gunshot that followed filled the room like a clap of thunder trapped indoors. Sarah looked down at her own chest with an expression of pure confusion, as though her body had betrayed some secret even she did not yet understand. And then the dark stains spread across the front of her dress, and her legs folded beneath her. The cards stopped. The fire kept burning, indifferent, while every man in the room stood frozen between the impulse to help and the fear of what helping might cost him in a town owned outright by the boy who had just fired the shot. Among them stood a young miner named Eli Carson, no older than 20, who had eaten at the same table as Sarah more nights than he could count. And as he watched her fall, he felt something break loose in his chest, some old chain of fear that had bound him since he first came to Mercy Creek, though in that moment he was still too stunned to move. Sarah's breath came in shallow, wet gasps as she lay against the floorboards, blood spreading dark beneath her, and through the ringing in his ears, Caleb Boone heard her whisper a single word. Please. He was on his feet before he had decided to stand, crossing the room in long strides that scattered chairs behind him, and he knelt beside her and took her trembling hand in his. Her fingers closed weakly around his sleeve and she pulled him closer, her lips barely able to form the words. "My brother," she breathed. Caleb leaned down until his ear nearly touched her mouth. "What about him?" he asked, though some part of him already knew. Some part of him had known the moment she opened her mouth, because 20 years earlier, a little girl with his same eyes had looked up at him in a hospital cot, with that same desperate need to finish a sentence before the dark took her voice away. "Tell him," Sarah whispered. "Tell him I tried." 3 words. Caleb's whole body went still, because those were nearly the same 3 words his own daughter had spoken to him in her final hour, a confession not of guilt, but of love, the last thing a person offers when they fear they are leaving too much undone. And for one terrible instant, the saloon disappeared entirely, and Caleb Boone was 20 years younger again, kneeling in the ashes of everything he had ever built, listening to the same unbearable sentence fall from different lips. He did not weep, not yet, but something in his chest that had been sealed shut for 2 decades cracked clean down the middle. Slowly, he rose to his feet. He walked past the frozen miners, past the bartender who would not meet his eyes, to the heavy front doors of the saloon, and he lifted the iron bar that sat in its brackets and dropped it across the doors, sealing the room shut against the storm outside and against the possibility of anyone leaving before the truth of that night was finished being told. Daniel Blackwood's face drained of color. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice cracking on the last word, the bravado of moments before already abandoning him. Caleb turned to face him, and his voice when it came was low and even, carrying none of the wild fury the room might have expected, only a terrible calm that was somehow worse. "For 20 years, he said, I lived with one regret. And I let that regret follow me from town to town like a dog that would not be shaken." He looked around the silent room, at the miners who would not meet his gaze, at the bartender wringing a rag in his hands, at Daniel Blackwood, trembling by the door he could no longer reach. "Tonight," Caleb said, "I will not earn another one." He turned to the boy and ordered him to kneel, to press his own coat hard against the wound, and Daniel obeyed with shaking hands, because something in Caleb's stillness frightened him far more than any shouted threat could have. It was young Eli Carson who finally broke from the wall, stepping forward to tell Caleb the doctor's cabin lay 2 miles south along the frozen creek road. And without another word, Caleb unbarred a side door, swung onto his horse, and rode out into the blizzard, dragging the half-drunk, reluctant physician out of his warm bed by the collar of his nightshirt and not releasing him until the man agreed to ride. Through that long night, while the storm raged outside, the saloon became something it had never been before, a room full of men finally speaking plainly to one another about the fear that had ruled them. And it was Eli who first said aloud what every man there had long thought but never dared voice, that the town answered to the Blackwood name only because no one had ever been the first to refuse it. Word of what happened that night could not be contained within the saloon's walls, and within a fortnight, a circuit judge arrived in Mercy Creek to hold session in the small wooden courthouse at the edge of town, a building that had stood mostly empty for years because no one had ever dared bring a true grievance against the Blackwood name before. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse filled beyond its benches, miners standing shoulder to shoulder along the back wall, and old Mr. Blackwood sat near the front in his fine coat, certain that money would settle the matter as it always had. But one by one, men who had never spoken against him rose to give their account. Eli Carson among the first, his voice shaking at first and then growing steadier with each sentence, until 12 men had sworn under oath to what they had witnessed. And the judge, a stern man unmoved by reputation, looked at Daniel Blackwood across the courtroom and told him plainly that no fortune in the territory could purchase its way out of what 12 honest witnesses had sworn to be true. Daniel was made to stand before the whole town and admit what he had done, his voice barely above a whisper. And though some in Mercy Creek wished for a harsher sentence, there was a particular justice in watching the boy who had once walked through doors like he owned them stand small and ashamed before the very people he had spent his life looking down upon. The elder Blackwood's contracts were canceled within the month, his claims contested by miners no longer too afraid to file them, and the family that had ruled Mercy Creek through fear alone discovered that fear, once broken, does not easily mend itself back together. Sarah Whitaker did not die that night. The bullet had missed her heart by less than the width of a coin, and though her recovery stretched through the long gray months of winter slow and uncertain, the town itself seemed to gather around her in a way it never had before. Women who had barely spoken to her took turns sitting with her through the worst of the fever, bringing broth and clean linens, and Eli Carson came by most evenings to read aloud from whatever paper he could find, because Sarah had once told him in some forgotten conversation that she missed the sound of news from beyond the valley. Caleb stayed through that winter too, though he told no one why, sitting some evenings by her bedside in silence while she slept. One evening, when her fever had finally broken and her strength was slowly returning, she woke to find him there and asked him quietly why a stranger would stay so long for someone he barely knew. Caleb was quiet for a long moment before he answered. "Because once," he said, "there was someone I loved who needed me to stay, and I was not there. I am here now because I can be." Sarah reached out and took his weathered hand in hers, and neither of them said anything more, because some understandings do not need further words. And then one bright morning in April, when the wildflowers had finally pushed up through the thawing fields, and the train whistle echoed clean and sharp across the valley, a small boy stepped down onto the platform at Mercy Creek Station, clutching a battered carpet bag with both hands, his eyes searching the crowd until they found his sister's face. Sarah ran to him before she had taken 3 steps, and the two of them held each other on that platform while the steam from the engine drifted up around them like something out of a dream too long deferred, and there was not a soul on that platform who did not feel their own throat tighten at the sight of it. Caleb stood apart from the reunion, his saddlebag already over his shoulder, because a man like him had learned that the kindest thing he could offer a family was to let them have their joy without the shadow of his grief standing too close to it. He had turned to walk toward his horse when small footsteps came running up behind him, and he turned to find Tommy Whitaker holding out a folded piece of paper with both hands. "Mr. Boone," the boy said, "I made this for you." Caleb knelt and unfolded the paper slowly. It was a child's drawing, done in the careful, uneven strokes of a boy still learning his letters, showing a family standing together beneath a bright crayon sun, their hands joined in an unbroken line, and beneath the picture, written in small, shaking letters, were 4 words: "Nobody should be alone." Caleb stared at that drawing for a long moment, and his hands, which had not trembled even when he locked the saloon doors against an armed and dangerous man, began to shake now, because a boy of 7 had somehow understood in 4 words what Caleb had spent 20 years failing to learn for himself. The tears came then, the first he had allowed himself in 2 decades, and he did not try to stop them. Tommy wrapped his small arms around the old stranger's waist, and after a moment, Caleb knelt fully and held him back. And somewhere behind them, Sarah watched with her hand pressed to her chest, smiling through her own tears at the sight of a broken man being mended by a child who knew nothing of what he had lost, only that he was a man worth loving anyway. When the train finally pulled out of Mercy Creek that afternoon, carrying Caleb toward whatever came next, Sarah and Tommy stood on the platform waving until the cars disappeared around the bend in the mountains. And as the valley swallowed the last trace of smoke from the engine, Caleb Boone understood something that had eluded him for 20 long years on the road. Some men are remembered for the lives they take, for the violence that made other men step aside, but the men worth remembering are the ones who are recalled for the lives they chose to save. And somewhere in that understanding, for the first time since the fire took everything from him, Caleb Boone finally felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. If this story moved you tonight, if Sarah's courage or Caleb's redemption found its way into your heart, take a moment to subscribe and join our family here at Desert Heart, where every week we ride back into the old frontier to find the quiet heroes history forgot. Hit that bell so you never miss the next story, and tell us in the comments which moment touched you most, because every comment helps these stories reach more hearts that need them. Thank you for riding with us tonight, friends, and we will see you on the next trail. The educational and reflective value of the story lies in its portrait of moral courage in the face of social and economic power. It illustrates how fear can silence entire communities when wealth and influence go unchecked, and how one act of conscience, joined by others finding their own courage in turn, can restore a town's sense of justice and accountability. It honors the quiet, often invisible labor of those like Sarah who sacrifice comfort and safety for the people they love. And it speaks to the long, difficult road of healing after profound loss, showing that redemption rarely arrives as a single dramatic gesture, but rather through sustained, humble acts of care, community, and presence. Finally, it reminds viewers, particularly those carrying old grief of their own, that it is never too late to let compassion back into a life that has long protected itself with distance and silence.